Hi, I'm Dr. Shyam Ranganathan, and the question that I was going to talk about, and I am going to talk about in a kind of roundabout way, is the value and importance of studying the Yoga Sutra if you are a teacher or practitioner of yoga, keeping in mind and fully appreciating that you've probably been exposed to the Yoga Sutra in your teacher training or somewhere along the way. And so you might think, well, look, I already know about the Yoga Sutra. Why should I bother studying it anymore? Okay, now, while I was thinking about this, um, I kept on coming to this conclusion, this worrying conclusion, that even though most people, who are familiar with yoga and take yoga teacher training, uh, are exposed to the Yoga Sutra, the chances are that whatever you learned about the Yoga Sutra is actually wrong or mistaken or inaccurate or just not the Yoga Sutra altogether. Uh, and there's a simple reason for why this is probably the case. Every translation of the Yoga Sutra, if you've ever bothered to compare them, says something kind of very different, and very few of them are actually within the same ballpark. They all tend to be quite different in their content. And let's assume that, for the sake of argument, that there's 100 different versions. There's more than that, but let's just simplify that there's 100 different versions of the Yoga Sutra, and these 100 different versions are being taught, at 100 different yoga schools. Each school's got one version, and they all say something different, but only one's the actual or the accurate translation of the Yoga Sutra. That means that you have a 1% chance of having actually studied the Yoga Sutra, and a 99% chance that you've been completely misled about what the Yoga Sutra is about. Okay, and so you might not notice this if you haven't actually bothered to compare translations of the Yoga Sutra, but this is pretty obvious to those of us who do work on this. And so one book that talks about this at length is a book by David Gordon White called The Yoga Sutra Patanjali, a biography. White is a professor of religious studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And as you can see, he's written a bunch of different books on yoga. And the book is called The Yoga Sutra Patanjali, a biography. So it purports to be a kind of historical review of how the Yoga Sutra was received over the years in Europe and in India, and White goes to kind of a historical analysis of how the Yoga Sutra was variously read and interpreted, and then he notes that even among scholars of the Yoga Sutra, there's a lot of disagreement about what the Yoga Sutra is about. And so I'm just going to read a small bit. It's in its concluding chapter, Yoga Sutra 2.0. According to popular Jewish lore, two Jews will produce at least 3 opinions on any given subject. So it is also with scholars with respect to the Yoga Sutra. Does Kaivalyam isolation, so Kaivalya is kind of the goal or the end state of yoga in the Yoga Sutra. It comes basically at the end of the Yoga Sutra. Does Kaivalyam isolation, the goal of yoga practice, mean that the practitioner dies to the world? For Johann Greenspan, the answer is yes. Yoga requires that the person disintegrate. It is the absolute unfathomable end, the end of ends. For Chris Chappell and Ian Witcher, 2 prominent scholars of yoga, the answer is no. Yoga entails enlightened engagement with the world. While Shyam Ranganathan, that's me, goes so far as to say that the Yoga Sutra is a work of moral philosophy, guiding men to become morally perfect in the world. Okay, so, and then he goes on to talk about, controversies and what is it really talking about. So, I want to say 2 things. White actually misquotes me. I don't use gendered language, so I don't think that the Yoga Sutra is about men. I also don't think it's particularly about humans, right? There's this kind of focus on human beings. That's kind of the primary point of philosophy, or a life well lived, is not really in the Yoga Sutra, and it's not a very Indian preoccupation. He's misquoted me in that respect, but he is right that I do think that the Yoga Sutra is really a text about our own ethical improvement primarily. and that the practice of yoga is about us overcoming our limitations to being good people. And these limitations have to do with a failure of us to live a life that reflects our freedom as people who have to choose and be responsible for our lives. And usually what ends up happening is that we end up living a life where we're not really in control. The forces of nature, whether it's psychological or physical, end up dictating what happens. And so the point of yoga is to take charge of your life so that it's no longer nature or prakriti that's really explaining what happens to you. It's you as a responsible agent that's the explanation for what's happening to you. But to get to that point, to get to the point where you're the explanation for your life, right, you have to take charge, you have to be responsible for it. And so the practice of yoga is about taking responsibility for all aspects of your life, which is why, breathing becomes something you do deliberately, and maybe, postural exercises. But these are all just kind of small aspects of yoga, and kind of ironically and kind of predictably in some ways, right? A lot of times people think that that's what yoga is. Yoga is this thing you do on a mat, and you do breathing exercises. That's just all part of the ancillary practices that help yoga. So when you look at the Yoga Sūtra, potentially defines yoga as the control of your mind so that you're able to live a life that reflects yourself. And then he defines it further in terms of 3 practices at the beginning of book 2. Approximation to the ideal of personhood, Ishvara, and then 2 further practices of tapas, which is breaking barriers, moving past restrictions, and swadhyaya, which is self-governance and self-control. And then, to practice yoga then is to try and do both of these things. You're trying to push past your barriers while you're also maintaining control. And then he says, right, as support, there are these limbs, and these limbs include things like assuming postures and breathing exercise. And so for some reason that ends up being what people think is yoga, but really that's just there as a support for yoga. Okay, now here I've given you a little, a little spin or talk about the Yoga Sutra, and you'd be like, well, look, Dr. Ranganathan, yeah, you're a smart guy, and you've studied stuff, but lots of people have studied stuff, lots of people are smart, and everybody has their own opinion about what the Yoga Sutra amounts to. So why are you any different from anyone else? Like, why should we listen to you? Why aren't you just some other guy who's written and talked about the Yoga Sutra? So this question was actually the question that creeped me out as a student. I wasn't particularly worried about me, like why should you listen to me? But I was more generally worried about, well, how would we know when someone actually read the Yoga Sutra or any text of philosophy and got it right? How would we be able to tell when they got it right? And how would we be able to distinguish that from cases where people were just projecting whatever they already believed onto the text? And then what ended up happening was they just ended up basically kind of, reading what they already believed, but they weren't really reading it in the text. They were just projecting it. So how could we tell these two phenomena apart? And so even before I got to the Yoga Sutra, I was interested in these problems of understanding text and translation, and especially as it applies to the mismanaged study of Indian philosophy, where there are lots of scholars who do work on this, and they all tend to have like a lot of knowledge in Sanskrit, etc. But they don't all agree on what Indian philosophers say. But also, strangely, I thought, and I argue and I show that for the most part, people were just projecting. They weren't actually reading. They were just projecting what it is that they already believed. And so what they were reading was never anything new to be discovered. It just already, in a way, was a strange reflection of what they already came to these books with. Okay, so as I was working on my PhD dissertation on translation, right, I started thinking about what's involved in reading philosophy. And one of the things that I started to appreciate was that in order to really understand philosophy, you don't understand a philosophical text in isolation. You have to understand how they contribute to disagreements that thinkers in a tradition have. And the reason why this is important is that if we can start to understand how texts contribute to a disagreement, no one has to understand it in terms of their opinions, right? Because these are almost kind of incompatible. If I'm trying to understand a disagreement, I'm not trying to understand the world in terms of what I take to be true. I'm understanding it in terms of a contradiction, in terms of conflicting views. And then, in fact, I don't even have to have an opinion about which side is right. I just need to know what the disagreement is. But, you know, the very different approach to things is to think that, well, anything that I read has to make sense to how I see the world. And then disagreement is something you can't understand. So two things actually happened while I was working on this. So one is that I developed this and it became my dissertation. And, and eventually, aside from my dissertation, I ended up writing about this more. And so just recently, this is like out of just this past year, actually, I have a paper that shows up in the Routledge Handbook of Translation and Philosophy. And this is an edited volume of scholars writing on the problem of translation. And, in my contribution there kind of builds on my work. And I actually also cite Patanjali in that article about how I came to understand how we crack this problem of understanding things and getting over our own biases and prejudices. And this happened kind of accidentally while I was trying to write my PhD dissertation in philosophy on this problem of how you read text without projecting. I was asked to teach yoga philosophy in the community. And I found that all these translations were like just these weird projections of what people already believed. And none of them were really kind of explaining or helping us understand how the Yoga Sutra fit into the disagreements going on. And so I ended up translating the Yoga Sutra from Sanskrit while I was working on this dissertation. And eventually it got, there it is, it's kind of glary, it got published by Penguin. So there is an introduction that's about the Yoga Sutra, but it's actually a translation with a commentary. Okay, so one of the things I think that's really interesting about the Yoga Sutra, or what I started to learn when I was reading the Yoga Sutra, is that not only can you only really understand it if you understand it as a contribution to the disagreements that philosophers in India were engaged in, and I'll get back to that in a moment. I think one of the big problems with most people who claim to teach yoga philosophy is they don't actually know what the disagreements were. They just think they have like a view about what this book says in isolation, right? And then they just try and teach you what Patanjali says. But like, if you can't fit that into a disagreement, then all you have to go on is what you think is true. And then all of a sudden, it's very difficult to distinguish between your opinion and what this actually says. Okay, so which is why I think often when people are teaching the Yoga Sutra, you're just getting their opinion. You're not really getting an accurate account. But what the Yoga Sutra talks about is it talks about you as an individual who gains freedom by being in charge of your life. But being in charge of your life means that you have to get over your own selfishness. And this selfishness that we tend to have is a selfishness that ties us to perspectives and makes us feel like we have to understand everything from some vantage, usually our own personal history and personal experiences, right? And that really coming to this state of liberation, of kaivalya, you have to go through the Dharma Mega Samadhi, and Dharma Mega Samadhi kind of translates rather literally into the rain cloud of ethics or the rain cloud of morality. It's a cleanse where we get over all of our biases. And when we can get over all of our biases, then we're really free. And that's what yoga is helping us do. It's helping us get over all of these restrictions. And the worst kinds of restrictions are the ones that we carry around with ourselves. Those are ourselves. Those are our biases. And we get over those biases when we learn that there are lots of different ways to look at things in life, and the way we come at things isn't necessarily the best. It's just the way we came at it. But what that means then is that there's room for disagreement, right? And then understanding what someone is saying is to understand how they contribute to our understanding of things we can disagree about in the real world. which is why if you're going to study Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, and you will really need to if you want to fully take advantage of what yoga has to offer you, you have to have a rather systematic overview of the disagreements of philosophy and the disagreements of Indian philosophy. So you can't just be like a yoga specialist. You have to understand kind of the big picture to understand where the Yoga Sutra fits into these disagreements, right? So I would absolutely invite everybody to take studying the Yoga Sutra seriously, but I think that if you're going to do that, you're going to have to look to a translation and a teaching of the Yoga Sutra that's informed by a knowledge of the kinds of disagreements and philosophical controversies that were at play in India when the Yoga Sutra was written, and that's going to be the evidence you need to understand why the translation or teaching the Yoga Sutra you're studying is worth taking serious. It's accurate. It's not just a projection of the translator. But also you'll be in a position to learn how the Yoga Sutra is an argument and a manual geared towards helping you get over your own biases so that you can live a life that's free.